Wrestling is all about heroes and villains. It's a live-action comic book, one designed to give people a morality play to get invested in. But in order to get the good guys over, you have to have the right bad guys for them to play off of. Luckily then, there are plenty of these to choose from. But who were the greatest villains of them all? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into bad guys, wrestling's greatest heels. And if we're going to start anywhere today, why not do so with the most modern example of a great heel, perhaps the greatest heel in all of the industry today, and that's MJF. Yes, over the last few years, no one has had a meteoric rise quite like Maxwell Jacob Friedman has with his perfect balance of douchebag manner and in-ring skill. He manages to come across like a classic territory villain who's been dropped right into the modern day. And what makes this all the more impressive is that at only 27 years old, he's just getting started, making us wonder what he'll be capable of in the future. But even if he is likely to get all the better as time goes on, this doesn't change the fact that he's the best thing going right now too, because with a few simple words, he can command a crowd in ways that few modern performers can. Of course, like with all great heels, in recent months his skills as a bad guy have actually seen some fans start to get behind him, and because of this, it looks like an inevitability that he'll have to turn babyface eventually. But before we get there, we can still look forward to a while of him being the biggest douchebag in the world, especially if he keeps giving us things like his excellent feuds with CM Punk, Bryan Danielson, and Adam Cole. And yes, there's also the fact that as of the time of this video's recording, he's the AEW World Champion, a belt Max plans to hold on to until his contract runs out in 2024. Will this see him carry out his own Summer of Punk and threaten to go to WWE with it? It seems likely, and to be honest, such an act will no doubt draw him even greater heat than he's been getting right now. That said, we don't expect he'll be leaving Jacksonville anytime soon, as Tony Khan must realize what a star player he has with the Plainview native. In fact, he's probably thinking of ways to build the future of his company around him right now. And if this happens, we see MJF continuing to build on his excellent gimmick as time goes on, with him continuing to draw inspiration from his own hero all the while, our next great heel, Roddy Piper. Yes, while the AEW World Champion is approaching the level of all-time great villain at this point, even he has a ways to go before he can challenge the kayfabe Scotsman, as back in the 70s and 80s, the amount of heat he drew on a regular basis was simply staggering. How did he manage to do such a thing? Well, by being completely unafraid to cross any line. So despised was he, in fact, that when it came time to find an opponent for Hulk Hogan at the beginning of the Golden Era, it was he who Vince McMahon chose, as there was simply no one else on his level. Hell, even if he'd eventually reach a level where fans couldn't boo him anymore, and he was instead forced to morph into an unlikely hero, it's always going to be his heel work he's best remembered for today. And the same could probably be said for our next subject too, as it happens, because while he was a great babyface in his own right, whenever he was on the dark side, Ric Flair was able to shine the most. Seriously, if Roddy Piper was the perfect villain for WWF in the 80s, then over on the NWA side of things, the Nature Boy represented the ultimate bad guy for more traditional wrestling fans. Why was that? Well, as the limousine-riding, jet-flying, kiss-stealing, wheelin'-dealing son of a gun, he was everything people hated about the excess of the decade. Yes, always flaunting his wealth and constantly adorned with beautiful women, Flair made it clear he was better than everyone watching the show, a fact which drew him huge amounts of ire each time he stepped through the curtain. Of course, it also helped his case that he had the perfect babyface foil to face off against at this time too, in the form of the ultimate man of the people, Dusty Rhodes. But even if he didn't have this, Slick Rick would have still been hated, as not only could he talk trash, he could back it up in the ring. That's right, as arguably the best wrestler to ever do it, he's regularly infuriated fans by, at times, keeping a near stranglehold over the NWA World's title. In fact, as it stands today, he holds the record for most wins of all time with a number that sits somewhere between 16 and 21. And when he went over to WWE for a second time in the early 2000s, and there helped to form Evolution, his reputation for being a bad guy was still enough to see him get booed, this despite the fact he'd long since entered the legend phase of his career. In hindsight though, perhaps such a reaction was helped by the fact that he was in a stable with our next subject, as during the early days of Ruthless Aggression era Raw, no one in the business was more despised than Triple H. And let's make no mistake here, this wasn't just regular heel heat. No, this was something far more personal, because fans weren't just booing the character of the game, They were also booing the man behind it, Paul Levesque. Why was this? Well, following the exits of Steve Austin and The Rock from the company, the general feeling was that Triple H was using the political power that came with being married to Stephanie McMahon to push himself as some sort of unkillable fighting machine, a figure in the vein of Harley Race, who was so dominant everyone fell before him. Needless to say then, this led to a lot of resentment against him from live crowds, as the people they often wanted to see get pushed to the top. Performers such as Booker T, Rob Van Dam, and Chris Jericho all had to be sacrificed at his altar. Yes, this was the infamous Reign of Terror, a 2-year time period which did so much damage to the game's reputation, people would continue to hate him for it over a decade after the fact. Not that he was too worried about this though, because as long as people were reacting, then he knew he was doing something right. And this allowed him to continue being one of the top stars in all of wrestling throughout the remainder of his in-ring career. And even when he retired and successfully managed to rehabilitate himself by becoming the father of NXT in the mid-2010s, he remained one of the most talked about figures out there, whether he was actively wrestling anymore or not. That said, for as great of a villain as Triple H was, even he'd probably argue that one of his peers was just as good, if not better. And this is because while he was busy dominating Raw each and every week, over on SmackDown, Edge was making the Blue brand his own personal playground. That's right, while he may be a beloved figure by audiences today, back in the mid-2000s, the rated R superstar was hated on such a level that it honestly harkened back to the kind of heat people got during the territory days. Seriously, if you were looking for a truly despicable figure to watch on Friday nights here, then you couldn't do any better than the Ontario native. But why was he so hated? Well, this was where real life blurred into the fiction of wrestling, as sometime prior to his rise to the main event scene, Adam Copeland had begun an off-screen affair with Lita, then girlfriend of Matt Hardy. So when this finally became public knowledge, it instantly caused fans everywhere to turn on the cheating duo, as they were deemed to be the real villains in this situation. That said, while this may have represented the death knell of a career for any other wrestler, both Edge and Lita were able to take advantage of the situation by fully playing up to their new heel personas, with them going so far as to rub the relationship in fans' faces by having live sex celebrations in the ring. And when he went a step further than that by becoming WWE Champion after cashing in his Money in the Bank contract on a prone John Cena at January 2006's New Year's Revolution, it only further intensified the anger towards him. But Edge didn't care about these reactions by then because he knew his actions had turned him into a made man, someone who would continue to dominate the SmackDown main event scene up until the point he was forced to retire from the ring abruptly in 2011. Yes, during the latter half of the 2000s, the Blue brand pretty much became the Canadians' show, as over that period he'd win the World Heavyweight title a total of 7 times, usually as a heel. Of course, even if he was completely owning Friday nights, he'd still have occasional competition for the role of top heel over on Raw, as there, it was his old tag team partner Randy Orton who suddenly found himself catching fire. Now again, given how beloved the Viper is today as a legend of the industry, it can be hard for some modern fans to imagine a time when he was so despised. But during the 2000s and into the 2010s, this was certainly the case. That said, why wouldn't it be? Because back then, Orton was well known for his petulant backstage behavior which at points threatened to turn him into a pariah amongst his peers. Luckily for the Knoxville native though, he was so talented in the ring that, like with Shawn Michaels before him, people were usually happy to overlook this once the time came for the bell to ring. And sure, it did make it an easier pill to swallow that he was playing the slimiest heel in all of the industry at this point, because if folks were expected to cheer him as well, it may have been a step too far. But they weren't asked to cheer for him. No, through his actions each and every week, Randy made sure he was always the most hated man on whatever show he was on. How did he do this? Usually by cheating at every turn. And that all eventually led to a career best run in 2009 when he started using his trademark punt kick to target the McMahon family specifically in a storyline which came to be known as the Age of Orton. That said, for as great as this was though, it only represented a section of the excellent heel work the Viper put out during his career, as both before and after this, he was also having excellent feuds against the likes of The Undertaker and John Cena. In fact, it was the former time period when he was still going by the gimmick of the Legend Killer that you could argue really first put him on the map at all. And even once all this was over, he continued to be a thorn in the side of babyfaces everywhere as far on as 2014, when he became one of the chief foils of Daniel Bryan. Of course, by this point, his skills as a bad guy were arguably already being usurped by the work of Bubba Ray Dudley over in TNA. That's right, after spending an entire career establishing himself as a top tag team act in the likes of ECW and WWE, Bubba Ray decided to change things up in 2010 when he turned on his longtime partner Devon and set about going solo for the first time. But this wasn't just any solo run as it turned out. No, this was a period which completely reinvented his character and added years to his career, as all of a sudden he was one of the top singles villains in the business, Bully Ray. And sure, it wasn't as if the New York native hadn't already proven he could be an effective bad guy during his early days. Just go back and listen to some of his old promos in Extreme Championship Wrestling if you want any evidence of this. But now, without the safety net of another half there to fall back on, the heat he was able to garner felt that much more impressive. Hell, so over did he get as a villain that by 2012, he'd be a heavily featured act in the biggest angle TNA had going on at the time, the Aces and Eights storyline. And with that also came the first of 2 world title runs, a major achievement for a man who never had any prior intention of becoming a solo act. Really, the character was such a blow-away success that once the Dudleys returned to WWE in 2015, even Vince McMahon was reportedly aware of the work he'd been doing down in Nashville. And that was why he very nearly allowed him to revive the character for the New York audience. In the end though, fearing backlash from sponsors during a time when he was still putting out a PG product, the boss chose not to go with Bully Ray on his television show, and this meant the whole thing would instead remain a highlight Impact fans got to keep as something of their own, a rarity in today's age of wrestling. Yes, usually when something becomes such a hit with fans, it finds its way over to a bigger league like WWE or AEW. But then should this really come as a surprise to anyone when the former has arguably the greatest heel of all time amongst the ranks? Who are we talking about here? Why, who else but Vince McMahon? Yes, it all began in 1997 when Vince started being openly acknowledged on TV as the owner of the WWF. And this ultimately led to the events of the Montreal Screwjob later that year, where fans first really got a sense of how slimy he could be. So realizing he was now public enemy number 1 no matter what he did, the North Carolina native chose to lean into this new villainous side by becoming the chief foil to Stone Cold Steve Austin over the next couple of years. And it's just as well he did this because with him being the perfect yin to the Rattlesnake's yang, it blew up interest in the product and directly caused the Attitude Era to be born. That's right, probably the most popular period in the industry's history, mainstream attention-wise, was fueled by the ultimate man of the people and his constant battles against his evil boss. And what a perfect evil boss McMahon played here, as each and every week, his increasingly deranged antics saw him garner previously unheard of levels of heat from live crowds. Of course, it wasn't just his war with Austin that made Vince a great villain though. No, he was also able to use his skills to give the rub to other figures like The Rock and Mick Foley too. That said, when the book is eventually written on his time in the ring, it'll be the Stone Cold program which takes full center stage, just as when the book is written on Brock Lesnar, it'll be his numerous runs as a bad guy post-2001 that everyone rightfully focuses on. But then, why wouldn't they? Because while he has occasionally proven himself to be an effective babyface, someone with the sheer intimidating size and power of the Beast was always going to work best as a heel. It didn't matter if it was during his initial run with WWE in the early 2000s or his return post-2012, there was just no better way to cast him. All you had to do, in fact, was put him in the ring with a smaller babyface and watch things played out as he bullied them to the point of submission. And once he had his run in UFC where he became a heavyweight champion there too, his sense of legitimacy only increased to the level where some fans now genuinely feared for whoever he was in the ring with on any given night. Honestly, at this point, he became such an established final boss for the industry that it's hard to imagine anyone usurping him in the role anytime soon. But then we wouldn't have it any other way if we're being honest, because whenever Brock does choose to lock up with someone, the atmosphere which is created from this simply can't be replicated anywhere else. Sure, in recent years his endless feud with Roman Reigns may have grown tiresome, but that doesn't mean he hasn't had other stellar programs against the likes of The Undertaker, Seth Rollins, and Cody Rhodes. And with him showing no signs of slowing down anytime soon, we expect this pattern of taking on the hot new babyface of the week and grinding them down to a pulp to continue on for a while yet. Hell, at this rate, he may even have a longer run as a top villain than our next entry, Hollywood Hogan. That said, even if Brock ends up with more years behind him than the Hulkster, he's unlikely to ever have the same level of cultural notoriety as back in 1996 when Terry Bollea did the unthinkable and formed the NWO. It was nothing less than a sacrilegious moment for fans watching. Obviously, this was going to be the case in hindsight, though, because prior to that, the six-time WWF champion had been the ultimate hero to kids all over the world. In fact, during the first boom period of the Golden Era, it has been his babyface antics which got people to tune in every week in record numbers. But as time went on and his audience began to grow a little older, they started tiring of the old adages of saying your prayers and taking your vitamins, especially once it became clear those vitamins were probably laced with anabolic steroids. So seeing the tide turn on him, Hogan decided to switch things up a couple of years after joining WCW when he joined forces with Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. And what a great idea this turned out to be, because with him now being completely refreshed, the rechristened Hollywood Hogan instantly became the most talked about person in the industry all over again. Hell, so much of a title change did his heel turn cause that it catapulted the Atlanta-based company to an 83-week winning streak in the rating war as the first fires of the second boom period were lit. Yes, you could argue that over time the heel version of Hogan did more to hurt WCW than to help it. But that doesn't change the fact he deserves the credit for taking it to such high levels in the first place. Really, given the business he did between 1996 and 1998, you could make a solid argument this is the most successful heel run of all time. Well, at least for an in-ring performer it was, because our next entry's sheer longevity as a top villain may stake him a claim at such a spot instead. And what makes it all the more impressive for Bobby Heenan is that he did this as a manager. Now, we will add a small caveat here, as the Brain would occasionally hit the ring for the odd match where he'd give whatever babyface he was feuding with at the time a chance to get their hands on him. But for the most part, it was his work from the sidelines which really allowed him to stand out. It didn't matter if it was the AWA, WWF, or even a late period run in WCW as a commentator, he always brought his A-game when it came to being a truly despicable villain. Seriously, if you think back to the 80s and the first boom period of wrestling, most of the big heels of the day were in some way involved with him. And when he wasn't managing the likes of Paul Orndorff, King Kong Bundy, or Andre the Giant, helping them get over with some killer promo work, he was continuing to make himself relevant by being a regular fixture on the announce booth. Need an example of his excellent work in this part of the job? Just look at what he did during the 1992 Royal Rumble, when he simultaneously buried every face on the roster in often hilarious fashion, all while serving as the most weaselly fanboy imaginable for Ric Flair. And this continued on when he made the jump down to Atlanta in 1994 too, and there proved he was still the best talker in the entire industry. Really, if we're making a list of the greatest managers of all time, Bobby Heenan probably goes right at the top. And the fact that he managed to get so over in such a role while always being a hated figure makes such a feat that much more impressive. Just as it's equally impressive that everyone else we've discussed here today has left their own unique mark on the industry, because there are few things more entertaining than watching a bad guy do his thing.